everyone. I know people are still logging in. I just want to say welcome to our training session, Planting Seeds of Hope, Not Hurt, with presenters Lenny Hayes and Raquel DeHerrera. This session will cover how child sexual abuse is an adverse childhood experience, ACE, that may have long-term effects on how a person thinks, acts, and feels, as well as short-term and long-term physical and mental emotional health impacts. My name is Valerie Butterbrett, and I work with Red Wing Consulting as the Training and Technical Assistance Advisor. I will be the presentation support in this session. If you need any technical assistance during the session, please reach out to David at red-wind.net or via the platform chat. Before we begin, Red Wind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to child and youth, housing and homelessness services, elder abuse, responses to urban Native survivors, and very recently, we were awarded the Tribal Comprehensive TTA Award. This TTA award ranges from policy review via email, one-on-one sessions, all the way through site visits. You can also review our website, www.red-wind.net, for additional information and services we provide. This project is supported by grant number 2017 TA AXK023 award by the Office of Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this publication, program, exhibition are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the reviews of the U.S. Department of Justice. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat by stating your name, organization, and the location you're logging in from today. Without further ado, I would like to give space for our speakers to introduce themselves. Lenny Hayes and Raquel DeHerrera.
Thanks, Valerie. Could you just go to the next slide? Before I introduce myself, I just wanted to welcome you all. Thank you for joining us today, and just want to acknowledge that I know today's topic is not an easy one to talk about and to be in that, to think about. So just want to let you know that, there are advocates here. I'm here. I know Amber is here. Lenny is here. So if you, if there are any feelings of uneasiness or you have a memory that you need to talk about, we are here for you, and reach out for us and take good breaks if you need to do that. And with that, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Raquel. I'm the Tribal College Campus Sexual Assault TA project coordinator for Red Wind, and I work with campuses on their sexual assault programs, where we really emphasize on holistic responses for victims and survivors on college campuses. Next slide, please. And with that, I will let Lenny talk about who he is in this wonderful slide that he has.
Thank you. Thank you, Raquel. So my name is Tukawanahi Luta, which means Redstone Ghost. My English name is Lenny Hayes, and I'm from the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the northeast part of South Dakota. I am founder and owner of Tate Topa Consulting. I am a mental and chemical health therapist specializing in marriage, family therapy, an educator, advocate, motivational speaker. I also identify as a winkta, which was the word that was given to me by my people. And then second, I'll identify as a two-spirit male. I am also a survivor of child sexual abuse and adult rape. I'm also a survivor of child mental and physical abuse, and I'm also a survivor of the foster care system. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenny. And I'm just so grateful to be on this presentation with you. Very powerful, especially at the panel. I was just really moved, and I'm really, really grateful to be here with you today. Valerie, next slide, please. So today we'll kind of talk about how childhood sexual abuse affects our Indigenous children and youth, and what resources we can utilize to provide holistic care to our children, students, whatever avenue where you are working with children and youth who are childhood sexual abuse survivors. And I love this, that some of our best traditional medicine can be found today in our hearts and our actions. And I absolutely believe that. I think one thing that I have found in this conference is just how much love I have in my heart to really help build a better world for our children, and how that guides a lot of the work that I do and how it moves me forward. And it, I think, leads with our traditional medicine. It really is. And Lenny, I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Well, I just think it's really important too. I mean, and also to remember too that even as an adult who has experienced, child sexual abuse, that and someone who hasn't grown up in the traditional or cultural ways of our people, that it's okay to learn all of this stuff as we're older too, and gone through our own healing. And again, it's always important for us just to be human with our young people, and just be human with our adults, and not be afraid to show our emotions, and just be good relatives to them.
I really love that, because I do think, there's a lot. I also I think about our traditional medicine, and I think about, when we hear those who might not know those traditional teachings, but I do think, and it reminds me of these quotes that from, Joy Harjo and Linda Hogan, a lot of people who talk about our ancestors and how they're always with us, and how they've prayed for us, and we pray for 7 generations, and I think it's inherent in us that we have it. It's just, having those teachings and having, mentors, or just, those who help guide us to bring us back to what we already know. So I really love that. Thank you. Next slide, please. So often our responses to sexual assault are really, it's leaving those who have experienced childhood sexual abuse nowhere to turn. And I think that can be kind of due to a number of things. I think for a lot of it, there's a lot of shame that comes with it, or stigma that comes with talking about childhood sexual abuse, whether even being a victim or a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, or even just that shame and stigma of talking about it in our communities, that this has happened. There's that one component. And I also think there's a lot of historical and intergenerational trauma wrapped up with it when we think about, Amber called it assimilation camps, and I'm going to use that more than boarding schools, because I think boarding schools kind of definitely doesn't quite capture what they were. They weren't no way schools and what we think they are today. But, I think the trauma of that, and where childhood sexual abuse was so pervasive and rampant, and really, I think it brings up a lot of things. So I think with that, it's easier. And I think it could be a trauma response. It's easier to kind of, if we don't, and I know in my family, this is something that I've learned, how we respond to trauma is don't talk about it. Just walk away. Don't even acknowledge it. And, it's like that denial piece that there's that trauma, but you don't talk about it. And I think that often leaves people and children with nowhere to go, because you're taught, don't bring it up, don't talk about it. And so that leaves children often in places where they don't know where to go, nowhere to turn, no one to, nowhere to really talk about what they're experiencing. So we really, when we're thinking about responding to childhood sexual abuse, we have to be prepared to respond immediately, and to respond, really think about our traumas surrounding it, and also our feelings around it, and to really get comfortable in that uncomfortableness, which can be really, really hard. That's something, it's if you aren't prepared for it, children are going to see that, youth are going to see that, and they're not going to feel safe to really turn to you. So we really want to be prepared to respond. And that's through a number of ways we'll kind of talk about in this, this PowerPoint on how you can prepare and respond. Lenny, I don't know if you want to talk to that.
Well, I think, you know, especially when we're talking about young boys who may have experienced sexual trauma, one of the things that we really need to understand is that we need to break down that stigma, because often, you know, through my experience in presenting across Indian country on sexual assault on men and boys, is that often people still believe that the boys who identify who have experienced sexual violence as a child and that's what made them that way. You know, that's what made them gay, and that's not true, because through my experience in presenting just specifically on the topic of sexual violence against men and boys is that, you know, across Indian country, I have had many, many conversations with men who identified as straight, who came forward and disclosed to me that they were sexually abused as children, but yet, you know, we're still not creating a safe space for them to tell their stories. You know, and one of the things I always say is that our experts, our survivors are the experts. They know what they experience, they know what they need, and we who haven't experienced, well, for me, I have, but I mean, others who haven't experienced that should really understand that we should be going to them and asking them, what do you need? How can we help you? Because again, we just need to, you know, break down these barriers, and we need to create a safe space for our children and even our adults who have experienced sexual violence.
Yeah, I was just going to think about, so a lot of work that I do are with tribal college campuses, and a lot of the time the work that we focus on is sexual assault that happens, you know, while they're students. And a lot of the time what we find is a lot of students are coming to advocates and counselors, school counselors, to talk about childhood sexual abuse, you know, and abuse that they've experienced, and that are now just, you know, talking about it and finding space and really making sure that we include childhood sexual abuse into our sexual assault response, create that space. Because I think, you know, when we think about childhood sexual abuse, you know, we kind of have a picture of children coming and youth coming, but often they're adults who are, you know, who are reflecting and thinking about, you know, where they are. I know for me, you know, a lot of the things that I've been going through, or the trauma and the healing, happened when I was, you know, got older and started thinking about all the things that happened when I was a child. And so I think that's a really great point to think about, creating space for adults, and especially creating space for men and boys to come and to really talk about that and break that stigma down, because we know that shame and stigma really, I mean, it's powerful. It's powerful in that it really can, you know, it can cause a lot of damage. And if we are not breaking down that stigma, then we're only perpetuating that, and only causing, and whether it's intentional or unintentional, causing that harm to just keep being a pattern. So,
well,
yes.
I think too, you know, I think with you saying that, what it also does is it prevents healing. You know, if we don't break down those stigma or those our own personal biases about that, then we prevent healing.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of, just like I said previously, just how my family, it was, you don't talk about it. And so we kept the stigma and the shame in place, and you had to carry that on your own. And that really does it. I mean, I can see the impact of my family, who healing has not, for some, it just hasn't been an option for them, because it's that, you know, they haven't had that space or people to hold that space. So absolutely. Next slide, please. So today we're going to really talk about what childhood sexual abuse is. I think kind of just the I think it's a big thing, but we're going to break it down just in terms for today, what it is, dynamics of childhood sexual abuse, who's at risk of childhood sexual abuse, and what the trauma from childhood sexual abuse could look like. And then how to get involved and find solutions to responding to childhood sexual abuse and creating space for healing from that. And then using Indigenous solutions to help our children succeed who have experienced trauma. Something that I have found in this work, and just someone who grew up, I didn't really grow up I had a little, my grandma would tell me little things that she grew up with, but it was never, this is our Indigenous knowledge, or this is our traditions because this is who we are. That's just, the knowledge that we have. But I know it's very powerful when it comes to healing. One of my favorite books is by Leslie Marmon Silko and Ceremony. And it really touches on how powerful our Indigenous traditional, medicine ceremonies are to healing, and how providing space for that can really help our children. And, listening to the panel and, Greg and Whirlwind and Lenny, how they are doing that work and using Indigenous teachings and, just Indigenous knowledge to really make a difference. And it's powerful. So we'll talk about that in this webinar, or this PowerPoint. Next slide, please.
So this is like one of the slides that I usually use, and we all know, but it's really important to like re-educate ourselves and remind ourselves about what is sexual violence. So when a person uses tricks, power, threats, or violence, we call that rape or sexual assault, especially when it's a contact with another adult. When the individual is a victim of a relative, people often use the phrase incest. Or when the child is a victim of an adult, it is called child molestation. So, it's really important for us to sort of understand the many different types of sexual violence that not only affects our children, but also affects adults.
Absolutely. And something that comes to my mind is also, and even just thinking about states and tribal law and how they kind of define sexual violence, and especially those who are under 18, or, age of consent, things like that to keep in mind. But really, these three things, I think, really encompass that, when we think about sexual violence.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide, please. So, and then this is through the CDC, just information on what child sexual abuse is. So when sexual violence involves a victim less than 18 years old, it is child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse refers to the involvement of a child in sexual activity that he or she or they do not fully comprehend, they do not consent to, or is unable to give informed consent to. They are not developmentally prepared for and cannot give consent. And then experiencing child sexual abuse is an adverse childhood experience that can affect how a person thinks, acts, and feels over a lifetime, resulting in short and long-term physical, mental, emotional health consequences. And we'll kind of talk about ACEs in the next slide, but just ACEs really do impact just overall health, and really impacts just mortality rates. And so child sexual abuse has long-term impacts that can be really, that carry through a lifetime.
So like,
go ahead,
I just want to quickly say that one of the things that when I'm out presenting about this topic, one of the things that I always remind people is that children do not consent, that they will often do what adults tell them to do. So a lot of these young children who are survivors, or the adult around them, the adult who is doing the crime or the abuse, is that they're threatening these children by saying, if you tell, I'm going to hurt you. And as being a survivor of child sexual abuse, that was one of the things that the individual who was abusing me said to me was, if you tell, I'm going to hurt you. So again, you know, when this is happening to a child and that's embedded in their mind, of course they're not going to tell. Or if that child's in a home where there's a lot of dysfunction going on, that child doesn't have a safe person to go and tell what's going on with them.
Thank you, Lenny, for bringing that up. I think that is so important to really think about, you know, and I also think about kids where, you know, we often tell them that they need to listen to the adults in their life, and that, you know, they need to do what adults tell them to do. And so I think, and that's where I think kids, you know, and I see this a lot, whether it's child sexual abuse or even when they are exposed to violence, even divorce, where children blame themselves for it, that they literally, you know, how they process it and how they think about it is they blame themselves. And so you know, even though we know that children do not have the ability to consent, they don't fully comprehend what is happening in their minds. They think, you know, why did I let this happen? You know, there's a lot of self-blame that come into it. And it is, as Lenny has mentioned, that is why it's so important to really emphasize that it is not their fault. Create spaces where they can have trusting adults, and to really start talking about this when they're younger, that you are allowed to say no. I know a lot of the time you don't have to give someone a hug, you know, if you don't want to. You are allowed to say no. Secrets, often, you know, you don't have to keep secrets. We don't keep secrets in our household, you know, or to kind of emphasize this. And I think, and we have to do it in spaces that are, whether it's in our schools as advocacy, as advocates, we really need to be sharing information with parents and caretakers on how to really talk about this, because I do think that's another thing where parents don't really, for me, I think about the shame and the stigma. There's such shame and stigma around childhood sexual abuse that it's really hard to even talk about the possibility of it, or to talk about how do you navigate this. And so we really do have to talk about how do we teach our kids in an appropriate, age appropriate way, that they know that they have autonomy, that they can say no, and that they can definitely let you know as an adult, or who are those safe adults in their life. Start thinking about, you know, if it's not parents, who are they, you know, and things like that.
Well, I've been approached with that question as a mental health provider, like, when do you start teaching these young children? And I always say you can start teaching them as soon as they start to understand, because sometimes children can understand as young as 2 or 3 years old. And so often sometimes people think that children are too young to be teaching them these things, and that's not true. You can start teaching them at that age about what's good touch and what's bad touch.
Absolutely. And I think even, you know, there's some statistics that talk about how young some kids are when they are abused, you know, sexually assaulted and abused. And, you know, it's really, I say you really always, you talk about consent, and you can do it in ways that are not, you know, we're not saying, you know, sexually abused, you know, but it's really teaching consent. Like, you don't have to give a hug, or, you know, even before I hug my child, I ask, you know, like, can I give you a hug? You really teach them that, you always need permission for those things. And they also, if they want to give somebody a hug, a friend a hug. I did this when my kid was, you know, 3, where he'd had friends and he'd want to give them a hug, and, you know, can you ask them for a hug? And that is how you teach them those things, and like really create a space that they they know that they can really advocate for themselves. Next slide, please. So to talk about adverse childhood experience, or ACEs, this was a study that was done with the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, and they really kind of discovered there are some traumatic events in children from 0 to 17 that impact just the well-being of their whole life. It can lead to a lot of things, such as heart disease, chronic illnesses, depression, a lot of things that we, kind of talk about as just being, health, but it really, can go back to adverse childhood experiences. So it's kind of a survey. There's questions that you answer, and depending on how many yeses that you fill out on these questionnaires is kind of your number of ACEs. And then that number really demonstrates like how impactful, and really what are the risks of that. And they found some of these events were experiencing violence, abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual violence, witnessing violence in the home or community, and having a family member attempt or die by suicide. And so a lot of these things, childhood sexual abuse is one of those that, the impact carries for a lifetime. And Lenny, did you want to say anything to that?
Yes, I was just gonna, I didn't realize I was on mute. But the thing I was, with what you just said too, one of the things that I'm always reminding our people that I work with are just family members or community members, is that one of the things that we will often do is compare trauma. And I'm always reminding people that we need to stop comparing trauma, because trauma experiences are different individually. And often sometimes you'll hear people say, well, it wasn't that bad, or it's like that, phrases like that, which can often be really detrimental, meaning that somebody who maybe experienced something, it may have a huge effect on them, may affect their life, versus somebody who has repeated trauma happen to them, right? So again, just understanding that trauma impacts us all differently, individually. And again, just maybe it could take one experience that can really impact somebody throughout their lifetime.
And that's such a good point. I think about yesterday, Rebecca Bela talked about, her and her brother and how they went through a lot of the same things as children, and then, how it impacted each one differently, how they, experiences, whether, you have more of a safe space to kind of heal and another family member doesn't, and things are different. I think two people can experience trauma the same, and completely that trauma transpires into something different. I think about me and my brother sometimes, where we both are talking about a memory that was very traumatic for both of us. And me, I'm very, emotional about it. And it's really, it brings out a lot. And my brother jokes about it, and kind of minimizes it. And I think that's that trauma, it's trauma either way, but it's different. The way we are expressing that trauma is very different. And so I think exactly this, that, you can have two people that answer yes and answer this survey exactly the same, but experience their life and the trajectory and, things can be very different and based on a lot of experiences. And so I think it is really important for us to understand that. One thing that I think that we can really learn from adverse childhood experiences, this ACE, is to really, what it kind of helps me think about is the adults that we are communicating with, and children, but especially, it's that trauma informed piece. And I think that's just our Indigenous knowledge, is that we all have a lot of things that we need to heal from, and to compassionately offer space and understanding to those. to people, because we're all, I think, traumatized in ways that, especially I feel like the world right now, especially, it's like every day you turn something on and it's just very hard. And so I think when we look at how this trauma in our childhood has impacted who we are as adults, it kind of puts perspective in the way we interact with everybody, and really brings more compassion in our responses and communication and interpersonal relationships. It really brings that. One of my favorite quotes that I love are, it's a question of, instead of asking what's wrong with you, ask what happened to you. I love that, because it has that human piece, and that, I think that really tackles that stigma and that shame, that there's nothing wrong with you, something happened to you, and this is how you did everything that you could, and especially I think children and youth especially need to hear this, because I think children and youth really, and I don't know what it is, I'm not a neuro scientist, I'm not an expert on that, but what I've just experienced is children really blame themselves for a lot of things that are not their fault. And I think that, if we let them know that, no, nothing is your fault. You are a kid learning how to live in this world, and how to navigate a lot of things that, our kiddos don't have a lot of power in this world. They don't have a lot, when we think about, and I think in the mainstream, I think when we go back to Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous values, our children do have that. If we really look at the root of how we raised our children, traditionally, our children were sacred. They had that. They had, sovereignty. And I think in mainstream, and when I think in the Western ways, children are not seen as that. They are, seen as to have power over, that you are, to be dominated. And so when I think about this, and I kind of transgressed from where I was going, but I just think it's really important that we, to know all of these impacts, really emphasizes that, breaks down the shame, and breaks down that we are all not to blame for what has happened to us. We're just trying to survive. Next slide, please. So again, some data from the CDC shows that sexual violence is common. More than 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced sexual violence involving physical contact during their lifetimes, and nearly 1 in 5 women and 1 in 38 men have experienced completed or attempted rape, and 1 in 14 men was made to penetrate someone completed or attempted during his lifetime. And we know with the NIJ report, and I can put the link in when we take a break, when we break down, more specifically in our Native communities, we know that women, it's more than 1 in 3, it's almost 2 in 3 women. And even, and I think one important thing that we take from that NIJ report is to really talk about how much our men experience violence and sexual violence, compared to, when we look at these numbers, and it's really high as well. And so thinking about that, I'll put the link in there so we can have more specific data. And then really, I think this one's a big one, is sexual violence starts early. So 1 in 3 female rape victims experience it for the first time between 11 and 17 years old. And 1 in 8 reported that it occurred before age 10. So when we think about brains and the ability to consent, that age is not, the consent, the ability to is not there. And nearly 1 in 4 male rape victims experienced it for the first time between 11 to 17 years old, and about 1 in 4 reported that it occurred before age 10. So it's happening at a very young age.
Yes, I like the NIJ report too, because that's specific to Native population. In that report, or in that data, it says 475,000 of our Native men have experienced some form of sexual child violence. I believe that that data is probably much more higher because we have to think about all the grown Native men who haven't disclosed yet about what happened to them as children. And we know, the historical context of what the boarding schools did to our relatives, our older relatives, and just the whole story of, the intergenerational trauma that's passed down from generation to generation. So again, when I look at that data, I'm glad that that data is there. But as a professional and as a survivor of child sexual abuse, I believe that that data is much more higher.
Yeah, and I'm sad to say I also think that as well. And I also, just going back to campus statistics, since that's a lot of work that I cover when we think about our LGBTQ and Two-Spirit community, those numbers are also incredibly high. And so it's really important to bring that in. Yeah, I think there's a lot of underreporting when it comes to this. And I know this is like a heavy place to take a break. Stats are always really hard when you think about that. I promise when we come back, we will talk about, protective factors and how we help create space for healing and make space for that. But it is time for our 30-minute break. So I hope that you can take some time to walk, maybe get some fresh air, kind of get some of this heaviness out of your body. And we'll come back with some really good things to move us through.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Again, we're in Planting Seeds of Hope, Not Hurt, Part 2 with Lenny Hayes and Raquel DeHerrera. This session will cover how child sexual abuse is an adverse child experience, ACE, that may have long-term effects on how a person thinks, acts, and feels, as well as short-term and long-term physical and mental, emotional health effects. We will go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hope you had a good 30 minutes. Hopefully where you are, the weather is nice and sunny. And I know here I'm in Minnesota, and I think Lenny also, it's been nice to be in Minnesota at this time. Nice and sunny. I needed it. This winter was probably, I've only lived in Minnesota for 2 years, and this winter I think definitely was one I really had to adjust to. But I hope you all had a great break. We kind of left off talking about statistics and data on child sexual abuse and sexual assault. So now we'll kind of move into the next slide. Valerie, if you can change slides.
Did it not switch?
Oh, I didn't see. Oh, there we go. Now it has. Yep. All right. So really think, this I think is important to know that child sexual abuse can happen to anyone. I know we talk a lot about risk factors, vulnerability, but really child sexual abuse can happen to anyone. It affects millions of people each year in the United States. Researchers know that the numbers underestimate this problem because of many cases that go unreported. Again, victims may feel ashamed, embarrassed, or afraid to tell the police, friends, family, or teachers about the violence. Victims may also keep quiet because they've been threatened with further harm if they tell anyone or do not think that anyone will help them. We kind of talked about this before, why children and youth might not come forward, or, again, and it really does depend on the age of the child, especially, younger children. They might not even really know, have the idea of telling an adult. Youth, maybe they have more, more of an idea to tell someone, but again, maybe they don't have anyone that they trust to tell. And so that can be really impactful. Lenny, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything to this.
No.
Okay. Next slide, please. Oh, we already took a break, so we'll skip past this slide too. And here we are. Lenny, I don't know if you want to take this one.
Sure. So I believe that probably everyone who's attending really knows what this is a picture of. This is the first Carlisle boarding school where a lot of our children were taken to, stripped from culture. We know that our children experienced a lot of violence here at this school. And one of the things that we know of is that a lot of these children were sexually abused by the nuns and the priests. And so for me, just really understanding this picture is like the beginning of historical and intergenerational trauma on our Indian people. And so, you know, our children that survived and went back to their communities, you know, passed on that trauma without really understanding, you know, there was just that disconnection from family because a lot of them couldn't even speak their language anymore. And so, you know, when we talk about child sexual abuse in Indian country, our relatives, again, have been hurt in unspeakable ways. You know, things are, you know, our citizenship was questioned, our traditional languages were forbidden, our religion was considered a sin. Our children still hear, you know, I'll send you to boarding school. You know, a lot of, I remember hearing that a lot as a young person, you know, with parents threatening their children about sending them to boarding school because they misbehaved or whatever. That has, you know, just a lasting impact on an individual. I mean, I had my own experience being a part of the boarding school. I didn't experience any, you know, trauma from the adults around me. My trauma was experienced by other boys within the boarding school. And so we know, you know, the lasting effect of, you know, that boarding school trauma. I mean, even my own parents experienced going to the boarding school and experiencing trauma. And then my grandparents went to boarding school and experienced trauma. So again, you know, we just really have to understand that impact of that historical intergenerational trauma. And I do believe a lot of us really understand that. But the thing is, in order for us to heal as communities, we need to begin to start to have these conversations.
Lenny, I'm reminded of, and I can't remember specifically when, but I just remember hearing it at another training when I first started this work about in Canada, they really wanted to speak to a lot of elders who, and their experience in residential schools and talking about it. And then you know, they had a lot of elders who committed suicide after that. And I think, you know, creating space to talk about it and then also creating ways to heal from it and to have that space, you know, I think we talk about, and I even think just currently what's going on when we look at residential schools and the boarding schools here and the mass graves that they have found and the hurt and the loss that we have. And that when we talk about it, it's not, you know, a past thing, it's we are still heavily impacted by it. And part of that healing comes from acknowledgement and also yeah, it just, I think there's still such a profound impact that every person has been touched by it in some way or form, whether directly, indirectly, family, you know. And I think a lot of this is where, and I don't want to say shame or stigma, but where there's a lot of hurt when we talk about child sexual abuse is there, it goes back to this. And even when I think about colonization at the very beginning, you know, sexual abuse and assault was a tool to, you know, really try to harm our communities. And so I think when we talk about childhood sexual abuse, it's heavy. and not just heavy with, someone coming to us, a child, we're talking to someone, we're working with someone, we're trying to process as advocates, therapists, those who are working, we're processing this, but then there's all of this other stuff behind us that comes to the surface that can like really be hard for our brains to even like digest through. So it is, I think, we really can't talk about child sexual abuse without bringing up this impact and looking at this. And thank you. Next slide, please.
So as part of my work, when I go across Indian country and I talk about child sexual abuse, specifically males, but we know also too the impact on females. But one of the things that that we don't really talk about is that disassociation that a child experiences when they're experiencing child sexual abuse repeatedly. But again, a person or a child who experiences, maybe one time of child sexual abuse, it has huge impact on them, right? So with me, when I talk about me being a survivor, and I experienced a lot of child sexual abuse from different male relatives in my home before I left the home at the age of 10 when I was removed. But one of the things that I have talked about is the disassociation that I experienced, meaning that I can still remember times where I would actually see myself looking down from the ceiling and seeing what was happening to me. Either I was being sexually abused or if I was being physically abused. I still remember those things. And one of the things that I also remember about my childhood too is that when I was at an elementary school, and because my home was so dysfunctional, when I would go to school, I would see these parents coming in and they would be hugging their children, just so happy to see them, loving them. And then for me, I was always afraid of going home because I knew what was going to happen when I got home. So I can remember a lot of times during my childhood that I would lay on the grass and I would look at the sky and I would imagine myself being between a man and woman who had no faces, but they were white. And so when I seen those things, I always thought that the perfect family was a white family, because the things that I seen when I was in school, and I would see these white parents just love their children up, but I never experienced that in my own home. And again, I mean, there's many different experiences, but with my own personal experience, I didn't have anyone that I could tell what was happening to me because the adults around me were the ones that were hurting me. So, but today when I look at disassociation, I don't think of that as a bad thing because, I've heard from elders when they've talked about that disassociation isn't a bad thing, that our spirit leaves us because it's protecting us. But when we look at it in a Western perspective, one of the things that I used to get really frustrated about was like when I was going through therapy, is that my sisters would say, well, do you remember when this happened and it was a traumatic event? And I wouldn't remember it. And so I would go into therapy and I would get so angry in therapy and I would say to my therapist, well, why can't I remember this? Until she finally got me to understand. And she said, Lenny, why would you want to remember that? You're experiencing trauma. And so I get it now, and after being a therapist for 12 years, but also just getting people to understand that, because in my own experience in doing therapy with adults who have experienced child trauma, getting them to understand that it's okay, your spirit left you. It did that to protect you, and that's not a bad thing. But often, sometimes when we even use the word disassociation in a Western perspective, a lot of our Indian people get really uncomfortable with that, and they look at it as a bad thing, and it's not a bad thing. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you for sharing that. I love that, your spirit protecting you, leading you to protect you. And I think I think we can't talk about victim blaming. We can't forget to talk about that. I think when we look at the bigger picture, then I think, yes, even Western, when we think about disassociation, there's this implication that you chose to disassociate, which then you chose to let this happen to you. I think there's that kind of, it's a message we get through everything, media, um, social media, pop culture, the way we look at things. And so I think, and it's something I've learned in this work when I first started, that a lot of the things that we tend to blame victims for doing is actually, it was their way of protecting themselves. And I love that you put the spirit protecting, because then I think it is nurturing, because I think often a lot of kids who go through this need that nurturing, and then to know that it's your spirit nurturing you and protecting you, that provides comfort and healing, and it takes blame away from something that has happened, and the way that you survived it, the way that you survived something that was really harmful and hard. And so I really love that. One thing that I remember doing, you brought a lot of things that kind of, while they're not exactly similar to your experience, where you saw, the white family as being perfect, my brother and I would pretend, we would change our names to be more white names, and, pretend that that's how we would imaginary play, that there was something wrong with us, two brown kids with hard names, and we would pretend, to be that's kind of who we saw as being good kids, perfect kids, and then also for me, when I, learned that this was in some way dissociation, but when really hard things have happened, violent things, I always imagine myself being an inanimate object, like pretending like I am this curtain, this thread on this curtain, or something. And I think it's the way we survive these things. And there's nothing to be shameful about that. And also, something that I've learned is to just thank myself. And I think thank my spirit for protecting me through that time and getting me through. I think it's a really important way to talk about it, especially when we have children and youth who come in to talk about it that way. Lenny, I really think thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I think, going with after the abuse stops, a lot of feelings come in that, also kind of impact how they feel as adults, as children, as they move through powerless, worthless, learn from being abused that what they do, want, feel, or think makes no difference, especially when it's repeated, a repeated abuse constantly, that no matter what you do, then nothing makes a difference. And so, that's that impact, that's that effect. And then start questioning themselves. Why did this happen? Why didn't anyone stop it? Why didn't I tell somebody? You start thinking about that, and it can turn into a lot of things. Next slide, please.
So a child is affected by sexual abuse when they may question their ability to defend themselves or may not trust their body to function in times of crisis. They may question their body and say, what did I do to invite this? They may begin to hate their body, and they also may begin to not respect their body or their surroundings around them. Often will begin to use alcohol, drugs, over or undereat, and smoking as a teen. Now, in my own experience, when I talk about this being impacted by child sexual abuse, I think about it as a child that was impacted by child sexual abuse. It was either I was promiscuous or I wasn't promiscuous, meaning that I would often wear huge clothes to sort of hide my body. And I thought that if I hid my body, then I wouldn't be attractive to the abusers, right? So there's things that we do that we don't even realize. And I didn't discover this until my own healing, when I was healing from my own sexual trauma. And again, I didn't understand what was happening to me because the adults around me were the ones who were hurting me. So there was nobody that I could go to. And I, through my child sexual abuse, I mean, I was impacted so many ways. I remember the first time I drank alcohol was the age of 10. By the age of 13, I was already a full-fledged smoker, meaning I smoked cigarettes, right? And these are things that I did to sort of cope, and didn't realize any of that until I went into my own experience of healing. But the thing that I always say is that when a child doesn't have the opportunity to heal, that child is going to take that abuse into their adulthood in many, many different ways. Meaning, like, I didn't know what a healthy relationship was, and because of all the trauma that I experienced, I sought out relationships that were abusive because I didn't know what was a healthy relationship, right? One of the things that through my healing, and I've been with my partner now for 13 years, but the beginning of our relationship was really a huge struggle because I was still really impacted by and not really understanding the sexual trauma that I experienced. But one of the things that I had to do when I went through therapy was I went back to him and I would say to him, it's not about you, because like he would like want to cuddle or something, and after a minute I didn't want to cuddle with him. And finally he said to me, he said, like, well, why are you doing these things? Why are you saying these things to me? Because they really hurt. And so I went back into therapy and did some more therapy. And my understanding, the thing that I had to do, have the ability to do, was to go back and say to him, it's not about you, it's about me. And I need you to understand that when I was sexually abused as a child, I had the rights of my body taken away. And so I need you to ask me permission to, like, give me a hug, or if you want to, cuddle, I have to be willing to do that. And so that's one of the things too. I mean, Raquel, you were talking about that earlier, about asking permission to do those things, but adults also need to ask children, is it okay if I give you a hug? Because we don't know what they may have experienced. That hug may impact them, or maybe it's the way that we touch them can bring them back to a memory of something they experienced as a child, being sexually abused or whatever. So we have to be really thoughtful in that, because then just that understanding that when we experience child sexual abuse, the rights of our body was taken away. So that's what I wanted to share on this slide.
I love that you bring that up, because I think, when we think about the impacts of sexual abuse and we read, the questioning themselves, not trusting themselves, that's really what that takes. It takes away this, we talk about, sovereignty, but it also takes away, I think, a child. And I think because children are so impressionable right now, the way that they look to adults, right? And so when something bad happens, it's I think the first thing is that you start blaming yourself. You start really thinking about what did you do to do that, to and as it says, to invite this. And so I think it's really important that when you're working with youth and children, to like really emphasize that it was nothing that they have done, nothing at all that they did, and everything to do with the other person. Next slide, please.
So in this slide, one of the things that I talk about is that the pieces of the childhood is taken away from the sexually abused child. One of the things that we talk about is that loss of memory of childhood. Now, what often happens to a child who experiences many, many different forms of trauma, it could be sexual abuse, it could be a combination of physical, emotional, mental abuse. That combination can cause that child to lose memories of their childhood, good and bad. The thing that I talk about in my own experience is not remembering a lot of good things about like what happened to me as a child, right? But I also lost a lot of the memories of the bad things that happened to me also, which is a good thing, right? I was talking about, you know, your spirit disassociation and like what happens. But again, but what's really sad is that I can't remember a lot of my childhood stuff, like even friends who I went to school with in elementary or middle school who will talk about like a school memory and I can't remember it. And that makes me really, really sad. But like one of the memories that I have of is and I hold on to that tightly is like I love the smell of bacon. And when I smell bacon, it reminds me of my grandmother because I remember as a child, you know, being a part of the foster care system, often they would allow me and my sisters to go and spend a weekend with my dad and my grandmother. And, you know, I could remember her like every Saturday morning cooking this big breakfast. She'd be making fry bread and I could smell bacon. So again, I mean, that's such a memory that I hold on to today. And, you know, that's like 40 years ago, but I still remember that. Loss of opportunity to play. You know, one of the things that I say about that is that, you know, as Native people, you know, and we come from very dysfunctional homes, a lot of times, or we come from homes where there's a lot of alcohol, a lot of drugs that are being used. Often what happens is that we aren't able to be children because we're taking care of the adults around us. So we have lost that opportunity to play, or we don't know how to play because again, we're being adults and we're taking care of our younger siblings, and so we don't know how to play, and that's one of the reasons why I'm such a huge believer when I work with Indian people is healing the child within, so that you can relearn how to play. Loss of healthy social contact. You know, again, when you come from a home where there's a lot of dysfunction, we don't know what healthy is because, again, we're growing up and we're seeing all this dysfunction. To us, we think that's a good thing, right? Loss of opportunity to learn, loss of controls of one's body. Now, one of the things I talk about with that is that because I had experienced so much trauma, I remember when I was removed from the home at the age of 10 and I was taken to a group home at the age of 10. One of the things that I grew up with is that because I had experienced so much trauma, which caused so much fear, that every night I would wet the bed. And when I wet the bed, I would often get beaten by my mother because I did that. And I remember the first time I was removed and I was put into that group home, the first thing I checked when I woke up was if I wet the bed. I woke up and I didn't wet the bed. And that was the last time that I wet the bed at age 10 in this group home. So again, that understanding of that loss of control of our body, because often sometimes too, you hear stories of like parents wondering why their children are suddenly wetting their pants, you know, in public or whatever. So it's that understanding that that's a possibility that they have been sexually abused. They lost control of their body, right? Loss of normal, loving, nurturing environment. Again, coming from a dysfunctional home, we're not understanding what's healthy and what's good. So we grow up, and again, like what I said earlier, I sought out what I was used to. So I sought out abusive relationships. I sought out dysfunctional environments because that's what I was used to, right? Because I didn't know what was healthy, what was good, you know. And there's many other different losses, but I like to talk about this slide too, just to get people to understand the impact of child sexual abuse on a child, and then taking it into their adulthood if they have not yet healed from what happened to them.
Thank you, Lenny. This, for me, when I'm after hearing you explain that, I think of grief, the grief of losing your childhood and
Yes.
how that's I think when we look at it, if we were to look at adults who, have lost their childhood due to child sexual abuse or a lot of other things, there's a lot of grief that comes in with that. And I don't know that we make space enough for that grief. And I love that you brought up, because that was another thing where it's like, this is where really nurturing that inner child will come in. It will really help, grieve that you as a child lost a lot of these opportunities. I know for me, there are a lot of things that I look back and I, especially as parent myself, that I'm trying, like, want to make sure that my child has these things, and but it's that grief. There's just a grieving, part of that loss of just your childhood, something you don't get back. And it's hard. And so I really appreciate that you bring this to the attention.
Well, I'll just give an experience as a mental health provider. So I was working with a Native woman who was impacted by child sexual abuse and also adult domestic violence and sexual assault, many forms of violence that was put upon her. And I was working with her in regards to creating coping skills with, she was experiencing a lot of anxiety. She had difficulty getting on the bus in the city because of her anxiety. So I was working with her on creating some coping skills with her anxiety. But one of the things that I said to her in a session that was so amazing was I said to her, I said, if you were a child right now, what would you like to do? And she said, Lenny, she said, I want to color, I want to paint. And so in our next meeting, I brought in all that material for her. And I actually sat there and colored with her because, often sometimes it's very important for us when we work with people that we do those things with them. And so I did those things with her. And so by doing that, it also gave her the ability to talk about what happened to her, but also to create that own healing for herself and healing that child within.
I love that. And I even think I encourage, if you are here and you work with children and youth, I really encourage just bringing a play therapist or an art therapist for children, because I think that, a lot of the times children and even youth might have, some difficulties not being able to really express all that they are feeling and going through and processing in the way that adults can kind of do, but they do that through play. And I think even, going back to your inner child, that those who've lost that child opportunity and lost and that ability, it's through play and art that you really, and I don't know what it is, it's just like connecting the mind and to something else, and it just creates a whole different dynamic in a space. And I think for kids, especially, how they process things and how they communicate is through play and through art and through those ways. And so, that's just very important when we think about the work that we're doing and and we'll kind of go through as we move on to the this presentation, ways that you can do that. But I think play is a big one, that loss of opportunity to play and just how important it is for even adults. I think as adults definitely need play. We need to just kind of be that child that we need to be. Next slide, please.
So one of the things too, when I go across Indian country and talk about child sexual abuse, one of the things, this is usually the first questions that I will ask before the presentation is, how many of you know of a child impacted by sexual violence? What about human trafficking? If so, what were some of your struggles and challenges? How did you respond? By asking these questions creates dialogue, because a lot of times, yes, we do know of relatives or even ourselves, that we may have experienced child sexual abuse or whatever, but yet we're taught not to talk about it, right? And so I like to ask his questions to the audience, because then that creates dialogue, that creates safety, that we can talk about this. But again, we have to be willing to create a safe space. You know, I talk about this one training that I did with this board, and the husband wanted to come with his wife when he knew that I was presenting on sexual violence against men and boys. And one of the things that he said, you know, he was very teary-eyed. And he said, what am I supposed to do when I go out into my community and the person who sexually abused me was a spiritual person? And he said, what am I supposed to do when my rage goes to the top of my neck, you know, up to the top of my neck? And he was very teary-eyed when he asked those questions. And I couldn't stop and just like do therapy with him. The first thing I said to him was, I believe you. And second, I said, I'm happy you didn't act on that rage. And lastly, I said, I hope that you find someone who you feel safe with to be able to work through this. Because again, we have to assure adults who have experienced child sexual abuse that they do have the ability to heal from the trauma that they experience, but also reminding them that they do have a right to create safety with the person who they feel okay with, right? So it's okay to think those things, right? And we should never question a child. We should believe a child. Because often, you know, what we hear all the time is that children are told, don't tell. If you tell, I'm going to hurt you, or I'm going to hurt your other family members, or if he or she goes to jail because of this, it's going to be all your fault, right? We need to be able to have those conversations with our children who are experiencing sexual abuse, and just be honest with them that it's okay to tell, right? So that's my thoughts on this slide.
I love that. I think that's something that I've, have been thinking about as I have a 6-year-old. And really what I want to emphasize is I believe you. I believe whatever you tell me, I will believe you, because that creates that space that, oh, I will tell them and they will believe me. They will believe in everything I say. I remember this year I went to an open house and just joking with a teacher, and I know she meant well, and I know the work that I do is very different. Well, not different, but I know where her mind was going with what she was saying, but for me, I took it a different way, but was talking about just, oh, how kids are, or they say something that, happened at school or home, and she kind of minimized it as like kids just make up things, and for me it was like, no, I don't want my kids to think that that's what we think of children, that whatever they say is made up, or that we don't believe them, because they really do. We need to create that space, and that whatever you say, we will believe you. Because it's often, even as adults, when we think about victim blaming and adults who don't come forward after they've been sexually assaulted, it's because there's this idea of they're not believed, that there's always they question. And especially going back to that man who, it was a spiritual leader. It was a very, that was a dynamic that it's like, well, who's going to believe me? This is our spiritual leader, someone who is well respected in our community. And, and I think what you bring is a really good thing to really talk about is these things that come up: rage, anger, frustration, that when we use to kind of define people, but we don't really get to the surface of why they are. So I think about kids, and we always talk about behaviors. They have behavior problems. They're doing this, even wetting the bed, and you blame them and you get annoyed and frustrated without really thinking about, this is unresolved trauma. It is unresolved grief. It's all of these things that are not being resolved. And we have to really make that space to be like, there's, instead of what's wrong with you, why do you keep wetting the bed? What's wrong with you? Why are you so angry all the time? It's what happened to you that is, that has created this, that has, really is impacting you. And I think you bring up just really good points. And that's kind of what came to my mind as you were talking. And so I guess, we can open this up. I think I don't know, Valerie or Amber, if anyone has the ability to talk or unmute themselves, or even in the chat, if you would want to share and have some dialogue. We can make space for that too, Lenny, if that's something. And I do see Anola had mentioned, I know of a young man who was sexually assaulted as a child and is very angry. And I don't think he realizes this is the root cause of his anger. I don't believe he has faced this fact or talked about what happened to him. And you know, that's, I think, so normal to think about a lot of our young men, you know, and I think it goes with just Western ideas of what is a man, you know, that anger, men are angry and that's just who they are, but it's really a lot of hurt and not having a space to direct that to and really talk about. I don't know, Lenny, if you want to mention anything to this comment.
Well, one of the things I really, you know, as a mental health provider and then working with our Indian people, one of the things that I always try to do is give them their power. And one of the things that I try not to do is to assume what I think, right? What I like to do is to ask them, like, tell me your thoughts, you know, because they may say something different that may not even be related to what happens to them, which causes the anger or whatever, you know, and always important, like what I said earlier, like in the panel discussion when I talked about it, it's like important to ask people, like, what can I do? How can I help you? You know, what do you need? You know, those are the really important questions to ask survivors, because often sometimes we always assume we think or know what's best for them, but really they already know what's best for them because they're the survivors, they're the experts, right? In any form of violence that we experience. But again, I mean, in order for us to even talk about male child sexual abuse, you know, the thing that we have to be willing to do is to break down biases. We need to challenge people in their thoughts, right? You know, one of the things that I always talk about too is that, you know, we have to stop assuming that someone who may identify, even a child who may identify, and if that child experienced child sexual abuse or whatever, we can't say that child, that's what made them gay or whatever, or that's what made them a lesbian, or, you know, whatever. We have to stop doing that, because what we're doing is we're also creating another piece of shame, right? Because that shame of who they are, you know, that shame of what happened to them. So we're just perpetrating more, and I don't even like to use the word perpetrating, but just creating more trauma on them, right? Again, it's about the whole idea of creating safety for these children to come forward, or even adults to come forward to start having these conversations. So.
Yeah, and I think, Lenny, it reminds me, we had talked about engaging men work a while ago, and I remember you all talked about how important it is to have space for men to just, you know, whether that's support groups, you know, drum circles, or just education groups, you know, to have that available so that there's an opportunity for them to talk about it, or, you know, and again, it's like one of those things that's twofold. You want to create the space, but you also, in the same, you know, line of work, we have to break down that stigma. You know, we have to break down the stigma of going into that space. You know, there's a space for men, but there's also a lot of men who are afraid to even walk into that space because of that stigma and because of that shame. And so it's a lot of unpacking that comes with the work that we do. And my heart breaks because I do, you know, I have seen, you know, men who have experienced abuse, and it has turned, into anger. And then there's also, it's, not wanting to really tell themselves that that's where it's coming from. And I think they know it inherently. They just don't want to admit that to anyone, and I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's a hard thing, especially as we're doing this work and we're advocates, responding to this. It's, creating that space. And then also, how do we help men and boys, come through the door without that stigma and shame attached? And that's a lot. It's a lot that we unpack. And that's where I think it really is important to go back to those traditional values, those traditional teachings about men and boys sacred, and that this is, who we are. And yeah.
Well, the thing that I always say too across Indian country when I do trainings, or specifically do a training on sexual violence against men and boys, I'm always reminding our tribal communities that when we think about healing, healing should not just involve one gender. It should involve all genders, our females, our males, and our two-spirit people, because that's how we're going to heal as a community. And that's really important for us to get into that mindset when we talk about healing our communities. Because if we're not going to, help our entire community heal, then we're not going to heal as a community. Because again, the importance of all our genders in our tribal communities and remembering all of those things before colonization, that's how we view things. But because of colonization, a lot of things were taken away from us. So, and just our views and how we look at people, and so it's really important to think in that way.
I absolutely, that we are all connected to one another, and when one person heals, we all heal, and so I love that. And thank you for sharing, Anola. I know it's hard. It's, and as Lenny said, they are the experts in this. And also, all we can do, and I kind of, go back to the planting seeds. That's what this is. This presentation's called, but we're really planting those seeds so that hopefully the next generation of men and boys, have that space, and we're really talking about it in a way. I remember, even just, I think, seeing my dad and my stepdad, and how seeing how different, they kind of walked in the world, as opposed to now my brother and my husband. We're helping to create more space for men to have those feelings. And so we're just planting those seeds. That's all we can do. And all we can do is just be there for them and believe them, and just, support them in any way we can. Next slide, please, Valerie.
I just wanted to say, guys, you're doing an amazing job. And I think that as you're planting those seeds of hope, some of the things that I just wanted to reflect on, and you guys can elaborate on, was that we are still going through the boarding school era, right? That was a few slides back, but how impactful it still is on our lives today as those older generations, our parents, and I'm heading to 40 here. So my parents are 70 years old, how they are still learning about their traditional ways, because that was something that was taken from their parents and our grandparents. And how when we're talking about not talking about it, right, when we're talking about disassociation, and like Lenny said earlier, healing our spirit and our spirit protecting us, right, when it's leaving us. I think when Enola then mentions this young man, I think of so many of our young men have their spirits, have a little piece of them is still protecting them. And so as they are guarded, for me, because I know some of these young men, I've grown up with them, I've loved them, I've, on different levels, as an auntie, as a sister, as a mother, in protecting them and in encouraging them to heal, it is really about what you mentioned, planting those seeds of hope, right? So how are we doing that in our communities? How are we planting those seeds of hope without having to necessarily tell them that what they're doing by shutting down and not talking about it isn't the right thing? Because it's not. That might be the right thing for them, if you guys get what I'm saying. But how do we just make sure that we're encouraging them to seek self-care, and what does self-care look like for them in their communities, I guess is what I'm trying to get to. Bringing it all full circle, if you guys got that.
Well, I think, I understand what you're saying, but I think one of the most important things to remember is that in order for us to create that healing, we have to create a safe space. That should be the number one thing. And when I do a presentation talking about sexual violence against men and boys, is giving this whole idea. One of the things that I don't want to do is like take away the violence that maybe a male may be doing on people. It's like, one of the things that I'm discovering in doing this work is like changing the language and really listening to what the elders are saying. Like I had an elder say to me one time, she said, Lenny, in order for us to heal as people, as a whole, we need to stop using that Western language. And so when I asked her, I said, well, can you tell me more? She said, we use that word perpetrator or perpetrated. That's a very powerful Western word. She said, we as Indian people, we need to start using the language that is sort of part of who we are. So she said, instead of saying that, what we should be saying is like men who hurt women, men who hurt girls, men who hurt other men, or men who hurt boys, or men who hurt two-spirit people. She said, because we have a lot of our men who have experienced, trauma as a child, then grow up and be the abuser, and then go through the process of healing, but they're standing in the background wanting to help, but yet we're still using this Western language that prevents them from coming forward to help. So again, that makes a lot of sense when we're talking about connecting to our culture or our spiritual ways or how we think. I really get that when she says that, and that's true. So the whole Western, and again, I'm being very respectful. I want people to understand that I'm not trying to take away the things that grown men have done, but it's that understanding, like asking that question, what happened to you, instead of why are you doing those things, right? So it's changing the whole language and how we talk about, because I'm like, for me, it's just like when I work with people, just understanding their experience helps me to go forward and say, well, what can I do? How can I help you? That's how I think of, as being someone who sits with people and talks with them. So it's like changing our whole way of thinking. And I'm having more conversations with elders in regards to like, how do I bring that framework into the work that I'm doing? Because I don't want to step on the feet of, these powerful women, Native women who have come forward and done a lot of work in our community. And that's not what I want to do, but I'm trying to help people to understand, for us to heal as Indian people, we have to create a space so that our whole community heals.
Lenny, you bring up a great thing that I think about we need to talk about more. I think that there can be accountability with love, that's done with love. And I think exactly what you say is, when we often, and I think it's going back to, this is called, when we think about this conference, and it's, restoring the circle that, and if we look at the Western way of how accountability is it doesn't restore any harm. It doesn't restore anything. And that, there can be accountability. We can hold people who cause harm accountable, but we also would do a disservice if we shame them, push them away, and not seeing them as humans themselves with hurt behind them. Because that's really, what does that do? it creates more harm, and then they don't heal, they don't reflect on, you know, some of their behavior, and they continue to do it. And so we do have to think about, how do we reframe? And it's a tricky thing, because we don't want to just say this behavior is okay. We don't want to be passive. We don't want to, I think that when you do accountability in a loving way, that does not mean that we let people get away with it. It is that we still hold the humanity of that person who caused harm. And I think the language is important. When we use perpetrator, when we use language, it kind of dehumanizes them, as they're not a human with all these past hurts either, that we also need to do. And so I think that's a really good point, that, you know, we really need to think about, and it's Indigenous restorative justice, right? Restoring things. We know, and I think it's safe to say, the way that we discipline and punish, you know, America, the main, you know, Western main America, the way that the prison system, it has not done any good. It does not restore things. It does not, we often see a lot of people, they don't, there's no restoration of the harm that was done. And so I think that's so important to kind of go back and to really think about how we just keep humanity at the forefront of everything we do. And even in the accountability, you know.
Excuse me, I had to sneeze, but I just really wanted to do a, follow up to what you said too. I think one of the things that we need to understand too and accept is that we have females who are also the ones who are abusing. You know, the many times I could tell you that I've been across Indian country and presenting, I've had Native men who identify as straight, who would come up to me and tell me of female relatives who abuse them. But what I remember the most is just that sense of relief that someone was talking about that, talking about this topic, and the fact that they understand why they carried it so much. But, you know, and how the impact, like, you know, I could tell a story of a relative that I worked with who talked about being sexually abused by his aunt at the age of 11. And he remembers the whole act of it, and then remembers going to take a shower and then just going off to play like nothing happened. And then when he took that into his adulthood, but not really knowing that sexual violence that happened to him really impacted him as an adult. And so, you know, one thing that he discovered was that he didn't know what a healthy relationship was. He married 3 times, you know, and didn't know how to be in a healthy relationship, didn't know what a healthy relationship was. And then when he was able to go to therapy and talk about these things, then he started to challenge himself in regards to his relationship to his 4th wife. And so he's like continuously doing his healing right now, but just really understanding, because, you know, he's like, when I think about it, you know, I don't know why it really, he said, I must have just pushed it down so much that it impacted me in different ways. So it's sort of like understanding that too. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of conversation that we could be having right now.
Yes, I mean, it's a lot, you know, a lot that comes into the work that we do. And I just think it's good to just talk about it. I think something that I have found in a lot of work that I do, after I'm at a conference, a lot of people come up to me and they talk about, you know, I think the number one thing that they need, a lot of advocates need help with or guidance, it's responding to men who have been victims of violence. And so I think it's great that we're talking about it. And I think this slide is just that special thought and prayers for Indigenous boys and men who experience violence. You know, one thing that I always try to put into a framework is a lot of the data and a lot of the way we think about violence and, those who do violence, it's that mainstream, we're talking about white men, and a lot of that comes with white supremacy. And I'm not going to say that white, and I think even in a patriarchal world, men suffer from the patriarchy, just as, they suffer from that too. But I think, when we think about our men and our boys, Native men and boys, that, and the NAJ study that we come up with, that we have, I mean, if you look at the numbers, a huge number of men and boys experience violence. And so, we have to acknowledge that, and we have to really bring that to the forefront of our minds as we do this work. Because then we I think we don't get to a lot of the roots of how to fix this. And I know we're coming up on time. I just wanted, Valerie, if you can go to the next slide. I did want to offer, just some things that you could do. Oh, and Lenny, I don't know if you want to take this on. I know we're right at time.
I won't spend a lot of time on this, but one of the things that I really want us to sort of understand too, the impact of sex and human trafficking. One of the things that I find so astonishing about this is, and that we don't talk about, is that I had attended a webinar at the beginning of COVID and was just blown away when and it was with two federal agencies, one of them being the Missing and Exploited Children's Network, and they talked about that 51% of gay boys are being trafficked. And when I had asked how much of that specific data was Native, they couldn't answer the question because they don't properly ask the questions. So this 51% is a national statistic, but to give an understanding that even our gay boys are being impacted by sex and human trafficking.
And I think you bring a good point. I think just, to go on to, how sexual abuse and just that trust and space, we know that a lot of, when I think about our homeless youth and a lot of those, when I think about our Two-Spirit relatives, and yeah, I mean, I think that number we're going to see that higher amongst our Native communities. And I know, next slide, please, Valerie. I think it's the next slide. I just want to think about just some things that we can do to really change. And we've kind of talked about this throughout, but really promoting social norms that protect against violence. And I think that comes with returning to our traditional values, returning to how we traditionally think about our community and our people, and then speaking up against sexist language or behaviors that promote violence. If you see it, speak up. Those education booths that you might have in the work that you do, and then offer to help or support in situations where violence may occur, has occurred. So getting out there and seeing, where is it happening in your community? Where are you, where, listening to the youth, having youth speak about their experiences and what they're experiencing, and to really, provide ways that you can offer support. They're, children and youth, they know. And especially, I think, oh my gosh, I'm 36 and I didn't realize just how much I don't know, especially TikTok. I didn't even know what TikTok was or how to do a TikTok. And so, and I still consider myself, well, I was like, well, I am a millennial, so I'm not that, old. Well, I am, especially like when you start looking at all of the things that I have no clue about. So really listening to youth, getting down onto that level and and just making space. And I don't know, the next slide, Valerie, if there's anything there, you can reach Lenny. I know you can reach out to Amber and Lenny and myself if you have anything that comes up where you want to figure out how to help those who are victims or survivors or impacted by child sexual abuse. Lenny, I didn't know if you want to say anything.
No, I'm good.
Okay, so thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you have a really good day, and yeah, take care of yourself, and we'll see you next time.